Welcome to Boston Real Estate Times. Our guest today is Jeff Talka. He is the Director of Science and Technology Group at Boston and New York-based architectural firm SGA. We are going to talk to Jeff about trends in the lab design, which market is really booming in Boston and nationwide. Jeff has led a design of lab facilities for more than 30 years. So we are going to tap on his experience and wisdom in designing lab facilities. Jeff, welcome to our show, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you. It's great to be here. Very excited.
Excellent. So let's start with what are some of the trends you have seen in designing lab in recent years?
Well, over the last 30 years, there's been a steadily decrease in the amount of wet lab space that's being produced, and an increase of more either dry lab space or computational supported research space, meaning dry labs. And what that is doing is affecting the amount of infrastructure that really needs to be provided, you know, the real high intensity infrastructure like large ductwork and large pipes. And instead it's being replaced with broader bandwidth to support computer aided design. And with that, and with the change of science from an empirical trial and error science to a more focused computer generated science, the actual laboratory environment starts to look like an office environment. So now you're going to be seeing a blend or a blurring of the lines between officing and laboratory usage.
So now, is there any regulations, for example, adding the lab component to the office building? So it can be done easily.
It can be done easily. I mean, there are certain requirements that tenants should look for in terms of the infrastructure of the facility. You know, a good floor-to-floor height, so you can get all your mechanical and electrical materials and construction through. Floor weighting. You want to make sure that you have enough capacity on the structural slab for things like cold rooms and refrigerators and things like that. But no, there really is no regulations per se. The zoning will typically allow it because a laboratory is a Class B occupancy, just like an office is, because it's commercial. The only aspect that you need to watch out for are what we call control areas in International Building Code, and that limits the amount of flammables and combustibles that you could have within a facility. So that, you know, other than that, you know, an office and lab space can peacefully coexist.
What about the office towers, for example? I think it may be easier in the suburbs and 2-3 story buildings. But what about if you're a big life sciences company and you have space in office tower? Can it be done there?
Yes, it can. As a matter of fact, there are some examples. SGA has actually put out a proposal, a project in Long Island City for a multi-story high-rise laboratory, speculative laboratory. The Alexandria projects on the east side of Manhattan are also high-rise. So again, what really limits the laboratory space in a high-rise are these control areas, limiting the amount of combustible materials that can be, that can be stored, above the 3rd, 4th floor.
Now, Jeff, earlier you mentioned that there's a big shift from wet lab to dry labs. And what is the reason for that? Why that is happening?
Well, it's because the science is changing. The science is changing to more computer enhanced, computer enabled research. People now are using high bandwidth computers with lots of memory to generate molecules and to generate molecular structures on the screen, as opposed to trying to do it, in a wet laboratory by mixing chemicals and doing snippets of DNA. So you look at an experimental approach, and then within the wet labs, it's a proof of concept. So it's just moving towards computational chemistry and biology, and by that it makes discovery a lot quicker, because you can model things on a computer much quicker than you can fabricate them in a wet lab. So
what about in terms of cost, for example? If you look at a typical lab space, 15, 20 years ago, and typical lab today?
Oh, I mean, the cost of certainly has increased because inflation's increased and things like that. But the trick is by knowing that the wet laboratories, which are the high consequence, high cost laboratories and the big energy hogs, if you can develop those in such a way that they use very effectively, and you could actually reduce the amount of wet labs that you need and increase the amount of dry labs or computational space, then your actually costs will go lower. So typically in a wet lab building, yes, the costs have increased, but if you're judicious about how you conform your building to react to the scientific trends, you can realize some cost savings and also some operational savings. So
also, Jeff, if you can talk a little bit about differences between labs for big giant or small startup life sciences companies versus labs for universities and colleges where a lot of research takes place.
Well, typically in the universities, you pretty much know who your user is. And those laboratories are fairly custom designed for those users. But for small startups and speculatives, you don't know who exactly they are. So you have to be fairly flexible. And you could do that in terms of the amount, and the types of laboratory casework that you employ in the project and the offerings that you give them. And in a lot of times, these small startups don't have the money to do a full laboratory fit out. So they go to, places like, Lab Central, who have already, pre-constructed laboratories, and, basically, a small startup will, kind of like rent the, furnished apartment, so, all the services are right there for them, until they grow. And then they could start, going out on their own and start, start building out, build to suit types of facilities that suit their needs as they grow and morph into a more developed company.
Now, what about let's talk also, Cambridge has been really the heart of this lab market, etc. Mm-hmm. And now we do see a trend moving away from Cambridge to suburbs. Where do you see demand going for the more lab space?
I still think there's a lot of demand in Boston and Cambridge. I know in Seaport we're involved with several projects, but yes, I think there will be a movement, a continued movement out to the suburbs, because prices are, price of land is cheaper, and cost of living is probably cheaper for the people that use the laboratory. So I still think there will be a continued migration to the suburbs. And
earlier you did mention more move to, as we move towards dry labs and office space blending. If you can a little bit focus on how the architects are integrating or dealing with the integration of dry labs and office space.
Well, dry labs, we'd like to actually introduce dry labs as a swing space between wet and office, wet laboratories and office space. So this way, that dry laboratory has certain infrastructure that can it could be embellished or heightened to accommodate a wet laboratory in a very short period of time at minimal cost. So we'd like to see that that dry lab space, or even we call them damp laboratories, can actually be the crossover between the wet laboratories and the offices. And what we also are doing in our designs is we have our total branding package that goes from the offices through the laboratories. So wherever you are in the facility, you know that you're with your company and you have that brand and you have that pride in place.
And how does interior design play the role into this blending these two areas?
Interior design is key. We consult and we have our interior designers as part of the project team. It's not just the lab planners that go and fit out a space with laboratory casework. There are things like color, lighting, flooring, materials, graphics that all have to pull together from the office through the laboratories. So the interior designers are from day one an integral part of our design team and our lab planning team.
So now you mentioned, it seems with our conversation, it seems that flexibility is the key, and also the flexibility is a good asset in designing lab space. Now, what about the products? Do you have enough products? I mean, the real physical products who can meet all these challenges today?
Oh, definitely. I belong to an organization called CIFA, which is the Scientific Equipment and Furniture Association. And it's an industry organization which combines architects, lab planners, and all the material and product manufacturers, the people that make the lab casework, the people that make the chairs, people who make the fume hoods. And we consult with them regularly in the development of new products. So we're on the cutting edge of knowing what's out there, both in the States and also internationally. And there's a lot of really exciting products coming down the pike that you'll probably start seeing in the States.
Yeah, excellent. Now, we all know that Boston is the center and, a spotlight for the life sciences industry. What are the other markets which are really growing in terms of lab space?
Actually, New York City is starting to grow. It used to be that New York was, very quiet in terms of life sciences. Although in terms of getting extramural grants like NIH, New York is within the top 10 cities, but they never leveraged that. They're starting to leverage that right now with their internal initiatives. So you're seeing a lot of developers really from the Boston, Cambridge area migrating to New York to start developing product there. But it's an early market, and it's going to be a growing market. I don't think it's going to compete with Cambridge or Boston, but in its own right, it's going to do well. I've seen in Austin, Texas, a biotech market going up in there. Research Triangle Park in North Carolina is certainly holding its own and doing well. Out west, you've got San Francisco area, also sure. San Diego. They're going to continue.
Now, the lab space is, of course, one segment of life sciences industry. What is your take that overall what is happening in life sciences industry in terms of their office, R&D, lab, and manufacturing?
Yeah, and what we're seeing in the Boston, Cambridge area is an interest now in developing GMP space, good manufacturing practices space, for scaling up discoveries into, drug candidates and also doing some manufacturing for clinical trials. We see that happening here now because the maturity of the biotech business right now is such that the companies are developing their products, they're into phase 2 trials, and they need the support of those GMP spaces. We've had conversations with developers and brokers in New York, and our question was, do you think GMP space could be viable in this market? And the answer was no. And that's because the maturity of the life sciences market in New York is not as far along as it is in Cambridge. So, it'll be a few years, but it'll eventually get there. But and there's a large inventory of GMP space in New Jersey. So, potentially when New York matures, they'll look to Jersey or look to like Long Island City to do those kinds of products.
Now, also, I want you to talk a little bit about SGA experience in life sciences industry. I know, from readings that SGA has really been doing a lot of life sciences work, and how all the different sectors play today in SGA's design concepts or design market.
Yeah, SGA is probably the preeminent design firm for life sciences core and shell. And we've done millions of square feet of it. And my role within SGA is to develop the lab planning capabilities so that we can provide full service for a developer or a tenant or a company to develop a leading edge life science facility. And that's a blend of three things. It's a blend of core and shell design, it's a blend of laboratory planning, and it's a combination also with corporate interiors and workplace design. So with those three, three legs of the stool, we can develop projects from ground up, full service for all of our clients.
Okay. Jeff, I really appreciate your time and thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll touch base in the near future. Thank you so much.
Okay, Upendra, good to see you.
Sure.
Okay.